and welcome to today's A-Team Group webinar on Perpetual KYC, Compliance as the Source of Better Business. I think it'd be better if you could see me. Hang on a moment, I'll put my camera on. There we go. Better. Right. So my name's Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor at A-Team Group and I'm going to moderate today's webinar. Our expert speakers today are Dr. Arta Golban, Deputy Director of the Compliance Department at Victoria Bank and co-chair of the ACAMS Eurasia chapter. Also Anton Nikai, KYC and AML subject matter expert, and Alex Zook, Managing Director, Product Strategy, KYC at Moody's Analytics. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in just a moment, but first some information on how you can make the most of today's webinar. To the right of the video, you'll see a box for questions and polls. We'll be running 3 poll questions today, so I'll let you know when they're coming up, and please do vote in the polls. It's useful to gauge your interest in the subject and its many sub-subjects. We'll be taking questions throughout the webinar, so please submit yours just as soon as you're ready, and we'll answer as many of those as we go along. So enough of me, and let me come to Arta. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your interest here.
Yes, my interest here is that Perpetual KYC is something new for our country, for Moldova, for Eurasian region, and it is also I would like to discuss here with experts to participate in this interesting webinar and to also to compare Perpetual KYC with traditional KYC and also to find out advantages of Perpetual KYC and also how to improve our capacities to be more effective, more efficient in our day-by-day activity. And I think Perpetual KYC will help us, and today we'll discuss about this very interesting topic.
Excellent. Thank you. Over to you, Anton.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you to the A-Team Group for putting this webinar together. My name is Anton Nikai. I'm a financial crime professional working in the industry for the last 17 years on various capacities, to as being part of managing a KYC program or managing a KYC program, myself, and working, for various financial institutions, including domestic and foreign banks, asset managers, and broker dealers as well. During my work experience, I've also worked in the process of, remediating issues related to consent orders, and then also with implementation of KYC systems and new implementations or upgrade to existing systems.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to the A-Team for putting us on this very important topic. I'm coming to you from Moody's, and Moody's is going to support our audience today in an integrated risk assessment, a globally integrated risk assessment of their counterparties. Within that jurisdiction, I'm responsible for being the managing director, responsible for our KYC, Know Your Counterparty, a business unit. And in that business unit, we really strive to help our customers answer 3 basic questions. With whom am I doing business with? What are the risks associated with doing business with them? And then how do I understand that at scale? And so by delivering both the data, the analytics, and the processes, we'll talk about a transformation that leads from traditional KYC processes or periodic KYC processes to the ability with new data, new technology at scale in order to come up with a more of a risk-based approach or a perpetual approach to understanding your counterparty. And I'm really excited to join the group and my panelists today.
Excellent. Thank you. So before we start the Q&A, let's get started with an audience poll. The question is, how much progress has your organization made on Perpetual KYC? So while you tick the box which is appropriate to your organization, let me come to Anton to set the scene and talk a little bit about how much progress he sees financial institutions making on PYKC.
Thank you, Sarah. So I think when we talk about the progress in Perpetual KYC, I think it's important to start with a definition, though they may vary a little bit, as to what Perpetual KYC is. So in my view, it's an approach which is powered by technology, enabling automation across all end-to-end periodic KYC reviews process steps, leaving a small subset for more complex cases that require some degree of human intervention. And then on a perpetual KYC, the goal will be to perform the ongoing monitoring of the customer's profile by having this continuous validation of previously collected information and evaluating kind of really any changes. So with that definition in mind, when I look at the state of perpetual KYC, I would say that while technology and data kind of really exist, and we'll talk about more of that later, I think, at this stage, most financial institutions have enabled only pieces of what would kind of really make an end-to-end kind of really KYC. And I would say there are very few, if any, institutions that have achieved an end-to-end perpetual KYC, on my view.
Okay, Alex, what are you seeing out there?
I think Anton has a really strong perspective, especially as we think about large tier one financial institutions. We'll talk about what's required around to move the model and to evolve a model and a phased approach to move to perpetual KYC. It is hard. It does take a different mindset. I find it to be a little bit easier for those in the fintech and neobank space who kind of get to build new and are taking a different approach around their customers and understanding that KYC, especially the ability to use KYC and knowing your counterparty in order to build a model of knowledge around your customer and then evolve with them over time, seems to be kind of a recent trend. But I would also agree, a lot of the tools and techniques are not new, but maybe we're reaching a precipice where they can really become democratized. So for example, we've been able to monitor customers' behavior through transaction monitoring or update screening behaviors through sanctions lists, political exposure, even adverse media for a long time now. We're just not seeing the full transformation, although those projects are certainly starting as more and more we're getting predictable in terms of the return on investment, and also the cost, both the operational cost and project cost that comes associated with the transformation as large as a mindset change in perpetual KYC.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And could we see the results of that first poll, please? And Alex, would you like to comment on that?
I think that kind of aligns, right? I think a lot of I think a lot of practitioners are looking at the potential, evaluating the potential of PKYC, having implemented it, right? And I think that it's fair to say that it can be done and probably should be done in phases as we're talking about the largest financial institutions. And some of that's going to come from the others like our regulators getting comfortable with the model changes, right? I think that's going to be really key. Senior leadership and regulators as well. We're already seeing some really good statements coming out of especially Europe when we're thinking about FATF or the Wolfsburg group driving some of that thought change. But again, still pretty early. So yeah, almost half of our participants thinking about the potential. That seems about right.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. And let me stay with you to talk a little bit about the challenges and outcomes of traditional client onboarding, just sticking with what we know.
Sure, yeah. And this probably is what many of us know in terms of the model. But let's just kind of rehash what that is because it helps us talk about where it can move. So if we think about the traditional approach, we're thinking about performing those KYC checks at the point of onboarding. Those KYC checks, whatever that is in terms of your product or your risk policy, many times it's done at the product level. That's going to lead to some information and some assessment, that risk assessment. The risk assessment is going to lead to a classification of risk. Let's just call that low, medium, and high, although I've seen high highs and low lows and all kinds of things in between. And that would essentially clarify the backlog of work that needs to be done. Now, when we talk about the traditional approach, I think many of us could refer to that as a periodic approach. And once I have that customer segmentation around my risk, then you're going to set some type of a periodic review or backlog review according to that risk class. So high risk may be 1 year, medium risk may be 3 years, low risk may be 5 or 10 years. That's all up to the risk appetite and defined risk policy of the institution. And then as those timelines come up, additional processes are taking place. So you're rebuilding and reconstituting that that KYC file, updating it for changes based on that periodic approach. So looking at a high risk customer or the products associated with that customer, potentially even asking them again for new documentation to justify any changes that they see on that periodic basis, on that calendar-led basis. I will say, what does that approach give you? That approach gives you what we've seen and grown pretty effective probably in the last decade is pretty predictable, right? If you understand your customer base, understand how you segment your customer base, you understand the time associated with that bolus of work, and then you make choices. Operationally, you may outsource some of it, or you may call in consultants to do it, but you know what work is to be done. And so there's a benefit and a consistency of that traditional periodic approach that's generally accepted, but there are also, of course, some really significant flaws and risks associated with the periodic approach.
Okay, coming over to you and bringing you in now to what challenges and outcomes do you see from the traditional kind of method of KYC and onboarding?
I can add to what Alex said, that periodical KYC, this traditional KYC, it is performed on a periodical basis. It's also manual most of times. It is time consuming. And I worked in many banks, and from my experience, the AML compliance teams face with lack of people to process this very huge amount of data. And also it is, I would say, most of operational costs are to this KYC updatings performed, how Alex said, for high risk more frequently, for lower risk once in 3 years or once in 5 years. And this is why Perpetual KYC comes as a solution to be more effective and to be based on triggered events, some kind of alerts based on because sometimes we have low risk customers. At first sight they are low risk, for example, but traditionally we need to update their KYC once in 3 years, and if we do not have a very well built machine learning, or how to say, very well built system of triggered events, something to identify unordinary or behavior, we will lose some potential suspicious customers, and we can lose some potential high risk customers behind these low risk customers. And when this Perpetual KYC with the approach to identify to make a mix of alerts from media, from monitoring tools, from other sources of information, it can generate a total alert, and this alert is a result of Perpetual KYC, and we need to focus on that customer and to update the information regarding this customer. And until the end, the bank needs to decide they want to continue the business with that customer or they do not want to continue the business with that customers. It's a matter of policy. It depends on the policy of each bank. They assume the risk or they do not assume the risk related to that customer. And of course, it is very interesting. It is trigger based on alerts, and of course, it is reduce the manual work of KYC teams, AML teams.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there because we're going to come back to the benefits of PKYC in just a moment. And Anton, I think you wanted to add a comment here. You're on mute.
I just wanted to add, thank you, Sarah. I just wanted to add that the current target operating model, like Arthur mentioned, is expensive, manual, and time consuming, but is also frustrating to both internal customers, so meaning sales and business management, and also frustrating at time for customers when they are repeatedly asked the same questions on the process of product addition or certain updates. And the most important thing is that the current target operating model that is pretty much out of touch with changes in the customer profile during the period of periodic refresh. So you're kind of really a little bit on the dark to what's going on. Thank you.
I think that's a great point, right? As a banking customer, if something happens, I sell my company or I move jurisdictions, I may be more acceptable to answer those questions or provide the documentation at that moment in time. If you wait 5 years and then you ask me about that event, I might have to go find those documents in order to provide that to my bank, and that becomes a little frustrating. So there is that value of that moment in time and becoming, you know, more current, and you're paying attention to what your customer is doing. I think that builds a tighter relationship. That's a really strong point.
Okay, excellent. Let's run another poll question, if we may. And this one asks, what are or would be the benefits of PKYC at your organization? Obviously, some of you are looking at it. What do you see as the benefits? On this poll, you can tick as many of the boxes as are appropriate to your organization. And while you do that, let me come back to Anton, if I may, to talk about why financial firms should consider PKYC and what are the business benefits beyond compliance.
Sure. So I would say the challenges kind of really relate to the, I guess, the benefits, you know, of implementing the PKYC. So on a compliance perspective, again, very important to note is that by instituting PKYC, the institution is able to have real-time identification, mitigation of risks, which would include, you know, sanctions, fraud, and potentially credit risk as well. It will improve the accuracy and quality of data, reducing human errors, you know, for tasks which are pretty much mundane and kind of really repeated. It would improve the customer experience. And by customers, I mean internal customers. So meaning your salespeople, the relationship management teams that the KYC team is kind of really working with and for. And then also it would improve the customer experience, meaning like a happier customer, you know, where it's kind of really, it's reached whenever it needs to be reached. If information exists out there, you have that information. You can go out to the customer for validation. It also, I think, it decreased in terms of business opportunities. I think it would decrease the time to market, you know, when you have the customer using new products and services, you know, like an existing customers. So you are able to kind of really have that information kind of really up to date and again, asking where needed for validation. And then, you know, you're able to keep pace, you know, with changes in the customer profiles and use this as business opportunities, you know, while at the same time also managing risk. So to the same point like Alex mentioned, so for example, if you are an international bank and you have a customer who now was operating in the US and now it's doing business on the Asia Pacific, you know, and you have a branch there, you can kind of really leverage those cross opportunities.
Okay, lovely. Okay, let's see the poll results, if we may, please. And Artur, would you comment on these and suggest if you see any more benefits that people should be thinking about?
Of course, as we can see, the benefits of Perpetual KYC are seen mostly to access to risk exposure in real time. It's true. I also agree with this statement, and most of the people who are watching now also think like this, and also it will increase the quality of analysis, the quality of alerts. We will focus on real alerts and not on mandatory KYC updating, which sometimes it is not so how to say interesting. It is mandatory, it is required by the regulator, and okay, we need to perform this updating of KYC, but when it is performed based on a triggered alert, based on some behavior of a customer in real time, also it is more interesting also for the person who analyzes this alert. And we can see also what we have here, that we will improve the regulatory compliance. I agree with this, because each time when we have regulatory checks, the main deficiencies are connected to this updating of KYC files and the percentage of not updated KYC files. In all the banks where I have worked, these are the most famous findings by the regulator. They find and they want very much to write this, and they do not care if maybe the customer is not active, the customer did not perform transaction for a lot of time. They say it is not updated, and you need to update this customer 3 years, 5 years, but you need to update this customer. But if we will build this perpetual KYC model, we will have also, based on policies and based on our regulations, we will have better arguments for regulator that we perform this regulatory KYC update, but based on alerts, based on triggered events, and based on technology, on automations. And also, it's very important to have tools, but these tools to be documented very well and to be very well, how to say, to the regulator proved. This is, and 44%, of course, of the reduced operational costs. Yes, of course, it contributes to the reduction of operational costs, and also to increase the quality of analysis, the quality of focus.
I thought that was interesting that was the lowest at 44%. I think that's probably where we as an industry have some more work to do. As you think about kind of the predictability of what the periodic form gives, and really kind of honing in on early adopters and showing that we're reducing operational costs. So I accept that was one of the, by far one of the lowest. And I think that's an area of opportunity where we need to do the most work. My favorite answer is no benefit worth moving to perpetual KYC being at 0. That's a great signal. But I agree. I think that's still where that's still where the mindset is saying, well, let's wait and see, and we need to really start to quantify that value of reducing those operational costs. I think that's a great observation.
Okay, I think you're right too. Obviously, if people look at the upfront cost, that's large, and if you start to split that out, that still looks large. But you've got to get going somewhere. Absolutely, thank you both. And Alex, coming back to you, how can firms approach a move from traditional KYC to more perpetual KYC? As you say, it's mindset. What else do they need to be thinking about?
Yeah. Look, I think the mindset's a great one, right? Because we generally say, look, first steps are we're going to think about the data, right? And you're going to have to certainly understand to have quality of data within the processes, availability of data within the processes, and that's a platitude. Let's be honest. Depending on the products you're selling, the jurisdictions where you're doing business, having a data availability, register information, identity verification information, having that be in a digital form that can be used by the models is not always difficult. It's getting better. I would say, spending, every year we're working aggressively, and I know other vendors are working aggressively to make more of that available. The data is super important. Data without the technology is an operational nightmare, right? You'll have too much data and not be able to really move through it. And so the technology needs to be smart enough to understand both the materiality and the context of the information and understanding the change. So let's be honest, we can't have every single change be material and be reviewed for perpetual KYC to be important. We have to be able to define what those thresholds are, understand the materiality, have that materiality be associated with our risk profile. And when those risk events are changing or triggering our activity, that's what's driving our basis, right? So that takes a little bit of that thought, but also to automate it through. Over time, multiple manual decisions, I know is part of some of my favorite things to use for supervised machine learning. As Idan mentioned, artificial intelligence is being important. I think something like supervised machine learning that can be very specifically applied to certain decision sets help with the redundant work of, for example, accepting screening behavior. And that's very important. Finally, it has to do with the process and operating model change that has already been brought up. And while that's, obviously we know that that's going to take change management from an operational perspective, I would encourage others who are trying to motivate the change or bring this change forward to involve senior leadership, both from the business side and from the technology side. So this isn't just a compliance function move. This is kind of a whole bank operating model move that will have benefits both from a technology perspective and from the front lines and the businesses. So start with mindset, got to get the data right, the technology and the APIs are really important, and then the process and buy-in, both from the business and then obviously finally regulators, can't forget the regulated aspect, would be really important as well.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Artur, what would you add to that?
I can add that firms can best move to Perpetual KYC. First of all, also it's data, quality of data, and also it's necessary to have a good project management team, also to understand the objectives of, and also to be the tone from the top, from the management. Also, it's very important, and also to how to say, to the company to perform with the changes in the regulations. Also, it's necessary to be always performed in time, and also to be a change management program. Everybody to understand that this change will impact all the organization, and it's important not only for compliance or for AML, but it's important for the whole institution.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Objective, that often comes up in our webinars as some projects set off without a very clear objective and timeline. So good point there. Thank you. Let's run our last poll now, if we may. It asks, what are the challenges of moving from traditional KYC to PKYC at your organization? Once again, you can tick as many of the boxes as you feel are appropriate. And while we do that, let me come back to you, Artur, if I may, to talk about the practical challenges that you're going to meet along the way. We've talked about data, we've talked about culture. What other practical challenges would you expect? We've probably covered quite a lot of them. Can you take that one, Artur, please? On practical challenges.
Yes, practical challenges is especially that it's necessary to be very well, to have a very good argumentation, and all the things. It's not implementation of Perpetual KYC, and the process, the project of implementation need to be very well structured, very well founded, and also supported by the management, first of all, and also to be in line with the regulations, also by the regulatory, and to be also by the regulatory bodies of countries. And it's very important, but also to have good advisors, a good team to implement, because without a good team of professionals which will manage all of these things, data, also the data, alerts, triggered events, it will be very difficult to implement Perpetual KYC. And this is very, very important for implementation.
Sarah,
Okay.
I've seen one of the practical challenges, and this isn't always for every institution, but moving from a mindset that's kind of product or bank silo based to a full customer base isn't as easy as one would think, right? And so while we recommend a phased approach of moving to Perpetual KYC, one of the things where you have to kind of, if I can use a bad analogy of swallowing the whole elephant, is that you really have to think about a customer-based risk and how that's going to evolve. Giving yourself some time to really think about that. Think about your ideal customer profiles and how they change. And banks who have done a series of acquisitions or brought other business lines in or expanded product lines over time, when compliance was based on the product line, you can kind of do that periodic based risk review. Now, when you're trying to centralize that identity of a customer and work with the customer, no matter what services that customer is using as a business, as an individual, as a family, et cetera, I think that's one of those practical challenges that just requires some thought. There's not a lot of silver bullets behind that, unfortunately, but it is one of those practical moves and operating model changes that I think just need some time in the project plan to address, because that is one of the big differences as moving to the ability to think about products as being high risk to then moving to a risk-based approach where your counterparty is actually where the risk is coming from.
Okay, that's interesting. Anton, tell us where you see the challenges, and at the same time, let's see the poll results. And Anton, if you'd like to sort of wind those all together for us, that would be great.
Sure. So it's interesting to see the major change project kind of really standing at the top, which I think, considering the complexity, like Alex was speaking about, of implementing an end-to-end, perpetual KYC, it's a major impact to the current target operating model, and an impact to many people in the organization. So having a strong project management team with, I would say, collaboration from IT and compliance and kind of really the business to understand and kind of really make sure that everything is triaged, before, things kind of really go into production. It's a major undertaking. So having a strong project management process in place, it's really very important. And then when we talk about the management and the buying budget, right? So I think the change in mentality, like Alex was speaking before, becomes really important here in order to highlight the benefits that the Perpetual KYC will bring to the business. And yes, it requires an investment in the beginning, but then also there is a return that kind of really comes through time. In addition, not everything is kind of really cost. Some of the tools that are used in the Perpetual KYCs are used currently on the process of KYC. They're not just kind of really used on a, I guess, synchronized, and together and with data kind of really cross-checked and with a lot of manual processes. So I would say kind of really stands out as well. And the resources, like compliance is a cost center. So it's always a challenge to kind of really finding the time, and the people to kind of really make sure that that's legwork, it's kind of really done, and kind of these proposals are kind of really put in front of the C-suite's management, who ends up kind of really making those decisions in cost, and the business as well. And in regards to legacy systems and processes, again, it depends to what stage the institutions is on their KYC program. So if you don't have a customer life cycle management kind of really tool, then most likely a lot of the things that we are talking about are going to be impossible to kind of really to be put live and to put in production. So you need to have those tools. So if you have certain legacy systems, who do not allow kind of really connection to the cloud, if you have processes that, again, kind of really IT that is kind of really risk averse and is not open to this technology, like a lot of change needs to kind of really take place here to make sure that the legacy systems are kind of really to some degree converted, or to the extent possible integrated with this new technology that exists, and again, culture resistance, I think it's normal. I mean, sometimes, if it's not broken, kind of really why fix it, and sometimes depending on the jurisdiction, it's easier to throw people resources at a task than kind of real technology, because people don't fully understand the benefit of what technology can do, which again, we go back to the beginning, change in mentality and so
that's very helpful, thank you. So with all those problems, coming to you, Alex, what RegTech solutions, services, tools and techniques are helpful here, as we've sort of ascertained through our conversation and our audience? So this is a big change project.
Yeah, sure. I think it goes back to kind of those pillars and then round it all up with what Anton mentioned in terms of a CLM or a lifecycle management tool with the intelligence in order to make some of those decisions. For example, I think you need to evaluate changes in corporate structure and firmographic information around business information if you're dealing with businesses. And there are databases and data sources that exist in order to help you understand that. You have to understand that from a global basis. I think I know specifically from the Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian sanctions crisis, we are seeing that ownership structure is moving around the world. You need a database that's going to be able to understand ownership changes and structuring in a global format, right? As these aren't kind of localized events. Certainly, other external information would be a stable of identity verification providers. Any type of global products, identity verification providers certainly have strengths in certain regions and not in others. So being able to kind of use that information, but ultimately what we kind of call a waterfall. So being able to say, if I'm not getting results from one provider in certain regions, how do I default to others, will allow you to kind of prevent that manual intervention early on if you have the logic to kind of fail over to different providers. Everyone should be monitoring, not just onboarding and checking at once, but monitoring sanctions, political exposure, and adverse media, and setting smart risk screening parameters, not just names, but other logical risk screening parameters. So they're only getting the material alerts that have to do with adverse media changes, for example. And as you know, I think that CLM that holds it all together is really important, right? So you're going to need to have the logic and the smart policies. Extra points if you're doing that without hard coding, right? If you're able to just kind of configure that policy, that you're able to make incremental changes over time, a CLM platform or a lifecycle platform, like what we use Passport here at Moody's with our solutions, that will not only take many of these different integration providers in our internal data, but put it in the context that will allow you to automate most of the decisions and only have to deal with the exceptions. And then finally, with those exceptions, what you'll generally find is you need to have the ability to then reach out to customers in a comfortable way, but in an audible way, right? Holding that responsibility, whether that goes through the first line or whether you go directly to the counterparty, you're going to need to get the information back, and having that information to be able to communicate it, put it back into the profile so that it can be processed for the evolving risk rating and that risk engine. So sounds like a lot. We have professionals that kind of walk you through it, but there is quite a few of those different pieces as you move along the data, the technology, the process change approach.
Okay, thank you. Anton, how have you seen this done, and what do you see as useful solutions?
So I think Alex hit the nail on the head, but I'll just add a couple of pointers here. So again, having that customer lifecycle management kind of really system, it's imperative. I think, you know, every company needs to do their homework in terms of what is the right solution for their needs. You know, are you kind of really a 4-branch bank, you know, operating kind of really in the US? Are you a global organization? So evaluating kind of really what's the best system that works for you, it's important. Having a low code, you know, system, I also think it's important, because sometimes being able to make certain small changes as your KYC program or requirements kind of really change, being able to make those changes yourself, I think it allows you to respond kind of really more timely to changes as they are needed. In regards to data, again, I would say it's unique to each financial institution. So depending on where you operate, you know, you may not need a very sophisticated data solutions, you know, because, you know, you may, based on your customer base, you know, you're not needing global data. You, for example, are needing for customers, let's say in the US, if you're operating in Connecticut, for example, right, then you have certain tools that may be more useful to you. So understanding kind of really the data and the sources of data that you need as primary sources and secondary where applicable, like Alex mentioned, to be able to validate the data, I think it's also important. And then on the process of data ingestion as well, you know, using APIs, and then also making a choice as to whether you are having multiple APIs coming on the customer lifecycle management solution, or sometimes, you know, using like a data aggregator that sits in between the CLM and this kind of really data. Again, a decision that the organization kind of really makes in that end. So.
Okay, lots of good ideas there. So thank you. Let's take some audience questions. And let me put the first one, if I may, back to you, Anton. It asks, is monitoring transactions considered part of PKYC, or is it limited to monitoring legal entity risk attributes, ownership structures, and screening results?
So I think they kind of really correlate together, right? So I would say, while PKYC is not necessarily a requirement, you know, from regulators, the transaction monitoring, it's pretty much, you know, required. You have to understand, you know, the nature and purpose of the customer's accounts, and you have to understand the activity. PKYC, I think, just kind of really ties in, and kind of really having a more accurate customer profile may also help, you know, explain and mitigate, you know, some of the risks, you know, identified, or better understanding of the customer transactions, and kind of really see when these alerts that are generated from the transaction monitoring can be kind of really dispositioned without necessarily a customer input, you know. So for example, again, customer has made a move on an other jurisdiction. Now you're seeing certain transaction flowing between the jurisdiction, when in the past they never kind of really did that. but at the same time, reaching out to the customer to make sure that the KYC profile, it's updated and it's accurate, and including these changes, in the customer profile. So I think they help each other. And when we talk about system and the challenges of legacy systems, its ability to integrate, right, all this data and technology that could come from Perpetual KYC from a transaction monitoring, right, where sometimes somebody has to kind of really log off, from the system, go into another system to be able to see the customer profile. And by having the ability to the systems to talk to each other, it kind of really improves the process for all the stakeholders.
Okay, great. Thank you. One for you here, Alex. And it says, does the panel think it would be possible or sensible to run traditional KYC and PKYC for different customer sections?
I think that's a sensible way to think about the evolution of and the phased approach, right? As long as you're very certain that your customer segments never overlap, which I think is sometimes the part of the challenge there. As you think about behavior of financial services and the solutions that you serve, if those are very distinct profiles across different product lines and you're very confident in that, then that's could be a sensible approach that works for your firm. However, we've seen more often than not that the value is having a single view of a single customer across those different product lines. I would also say one of the benefits of Perpetual KYC is it takes a little bit of the pressure off of that magic moment where you think you get your customer risk segmentation perfectly right. Let's be honest, if someone is going to launder money through your financial institution, you probably do your onboarding process as clean as possible. And then you know how to change your profile because someone might not look at you for another 5 years. That's plenty of time for you to get your money through that institution very quickly, right? Not saying that happens, but I know it does, right? And so, look, I think you just have to, that may be specific to your institution where that makes the most sense, and you kind of have these distinct bodies of counterparties and businesses and individuals, but it's something that you'd probably want to have a lot of confidence in before you took that approach. But it could be a method depending on the institution.
Okay, thank you. And Arthur, a question for you. And it says, we are a smallish firm and PYKC looks costly to implement and run 24/7. Is there a cutoff where it does not really provide ROI? I guess it's a small kind of firm saying, is this the sort of thing we should be doing or not?
Yeah, I mean, I have experience where I know that this really actually kind of benefits smaller firms where you don't end up where smaller firms don't have the ability to scale up and scale down for these big backlog or periodic reviews. It almost kind of makes the work more consistent, and over time you start to see it. So where I've seen it actually work best and work and transform the fastest has been smaller firms that have been able to grow into it. And so, I wouldn't be afraid of the upfront costs. I think there are more solutions and tools. We're not talking about a CLM that takes 6 years to deploy. When you're talking about a smaller institution, let's avoid that. There are SaaS solutions that we offer that will get you started this afternoon, and you can integrate the data that you need and build that over time. So I think the industry is kind of meeting the market and the problem set a little bit better than we had 5 years ago. So I think there are solutions out there that may fit the smaller firm a little bit better than what had been in the past, which this was a massive transformation that took years to undertake.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your questions, and thank you to our speakers for answering them. Let's move on with my questions. And Arthur, coming to you, when and how can firms know they're making cost-efficient and effective progress towards PKYC? What's the tipping point here?
Yes, related to when they will understand, it's something like Alex said, it's evolution, and we are moving, we are developing, and the Perpetual KYC is also as a stage of focusing on real customers with alerts alerts generated by, how to say, suspicious behaviors or unusual behaviors, not the ordinary behaviors, and they will, okay, companies will understand when the effectiveness will come, when they will, how to say, there are a lot of fines also by not updating the KYC, and when you use such kind of model, you are protected, and you are also very how to say, not attractive for money launderers and for criminals. And of course, how Alex said, very good pointed, that money launderers, for traditional KYC, they orient for banks who use traditional KYC, and after 5 years, of course, the bank will perform this KYC, but during this period, I can launder money, I can do everything I want there. But with Perpetual KYC, it's real, and it's alerts generated by these unusual transactions, unusual behaviors, and of course, firms will be, when other firms can be fined, they will be, of course, protected.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. The good place to be. Alex, where would you say is sort of the good place to be? When will they know that they're sort of hit the tipping point and this is really going to be a success?
I think just being conversational and being totally transparent, I think that's where we need to really progress in this industry. I think we need to, next time we have this conversation, we should be talking about some of those specific metrics, how to apply and how to measure that success. I think as our poll, as our listeners and our viewers have mentioned, we're still thinking about this, and it's a bit academic. We know it's the right thing to do, and we know how to get there. How we measure it and how we measure effectiveness, I think it's really going to come down to proving out that this is a better business decision. This is a better way to do business with our counterparties. This is this reduces friction. This reduces pressure. We know it's going to be better from a risk perspective, both from that reputational timing and a regulatory risk perspective. But I'd really like to see us in a little bit of time be able to talk about the economic benefits of moving into perpetual KYC. So be focused on that. And next time we talk about it, Sarah, we'll have a better answer about what some of those measures are.
We certainly can. Thank you very much, Alex. And coming over to you again, Anton, tell me a little, a case study, I should say, of a firm that you've seen sort of begin down this road successfully.
Sure. So this is like a UK entity, that has about, 25,000 customers. So not necessarily a huge number of customers, but like Alex mentioned, ability to implement, solutions on a small scale as well. So they do use a couple, they do use a couple of vendors in their process for data. So they use, for example, DNB, Moody Analytics, and Quantexa, and they kind of really they use this data at onboarding as well by pinging, kind of really getting customer data before they reach out to the customer for onboarding documentation, and they get both documentation and data. They have a set of data points and documentation based on the KYC program that are required, with fields and data that are both mandatory and certain data that are not necessarily mandatory, meaning not required if they're not available. So once they complete the onboarding process and their risk is rated and set in stone, once the customer documentation has been provided, they kind of really go through this perpetual ongoing KYC where changes are kind of really monitored. So for example, if the board of directors kind of really changes and the information is available, the changes come in, and somebody kind of really may need to evaluate those changes based on materiality, so not necessarily every single change may require a material event and a touch point from humans. So if Sarah now becomes a director, Sarah's names kind of really comes into the KYC system, gets screened, there is no hits, there is no human intervention. But if hits kind of really are, that needs certain human intervention, they may be reviewed by an individual if the system cannot disposition those. And then, during the, so they're kind of really able to do this kind of really on a more ongoing basis for the customer, and they minimize the customer interaction, going back to the customer if there is changes, for example, in ownership and certain attestation, which may be required because that's, especially in the US, it's a legal requirement to obtain, and have customer kind of really confirm that information when changes kind of really do happen. But again, this is a small kind of really success story.
That's fine. We've got to start somewhere. Alex,
sure.
do you have a short case study you'd like to add?
I think one of the models that we see from this perpetual KYC is really starting with those who have the luxury of thinking about it differently and starting over. So neobanks and fintechs who are starting with scratch and thinking about their compliance programs and really kind of using some of the principles that we've learned that work from a marketing perspective or from a business development perspective around understanding your customer, understanding those small changes, testing and changing that risk policy has been most effective. So there's a whole world and kind of market and industry. And so I think that is now moving into traditional finance, if I would, I think the regulators who had started at traditional finance and now understand that they need to move into fintechs and neobanking as well, and they have been there, but certainly where that traditional finance has been a little bit more conservative, given the fact that those regulations and those policies had been written in stone. When you talk about your traditional approach, that's been that's been an area where it's proven that it's effective. Certainly, even sometimes more effective as those neobanks and fintechs have been a higher risk target. As Artur has mentioned, if you think you have a target, that generally kind of builds on each other. So that has been an area where the focus is. We're certainly seeing that transition and certainly seeing more requests for information about that move to perpetual KYC, the availability of data, proving coverage. So on the vendor side, we are seeing many more questions and starting those projects using the phased approach and ultimately trying to kind of build that over time. This isn't a big bang effort, right? I wouldn't recommend that you're going to get it right on the first take. It's a little bit as I do. My job on the daily basis is develop software. We use things like an agile approach where you kind of challenge yourself on how can we get a little bit better and how can we make this stronger. Building that back into our policies and our risk policies off of a good set of customer data is really where the promise is. So I'd say different industries are doing this, have been doing this. It's moving into traditional finance. There are pockets within traditional finance all around the globe. It's actually, it's not just a European thing where we're seeing FATF or Wolfberg Group guidance, but we are seeing this across North America, the Americas. We are seeing it in Europe, and we're certainly, and we're in ongoing projects right now in Asia Pacific, where the multi-payment, buy now, pay later space is blending with traditional banking, and they're really focused on making the move.
Okay, thank you. And Artur, coming back to you briefly as we are coming close to the end of the webinar. Will it become critical for firms to sustain a competitive position in capital markets? Will it be critical that they implement perpetual KYC?
Yes, of course, I think perpetual KYC will become the competitive advantage of companies, and of course, it will help companies to focus on real triggered alerts and also on unusual customers' behaviors. And also, but not forget, it is very important all of these things to be documented very well in compliance with the regulatory requirements, and also but of course, to have all of these things, it is necessary the tone from the top, from the management.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Let's come to my final question. I'd like to ask all our speakers for some advice they can share with practitioners considering or actually starting to work on PKYC. Alex, would you like to kick off here?
Oh, that's tough. I think we certainly have given a lot to think about. I think that when you're thinking about this, maybe it was said before, and I think it was, don't go about it alone. I think when I applaud everyone who's spending the time to listen to the webinar today. As you're thinking about this approach and you've kind of been convinced that you think it's a good idea, you want to enlist some friends to do it with you. That those friends are going to include industry experts who are going to be able to kind of guide you and tell you where it's been done before. I'm seeing great groups of industry leads that are kind of working together and sharing best practices. And there's many forms of those practices. If you don't know one or want to be connected to one, reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'll connect you to something that makes sense for your region or the type of institution you're representing. And finally, you're educating yourself on this now, even if it's not a project you're undertaking within the next 6 to 12 months, I think is absolutely critical. Why? The rate of development and the rate of change that's enabling this. If you took a look at this 3 years later or 3 years from now, you will be so far behind as an industry practitioner. So I applaud people that are kind of interested, intellectually curious, even if you don't have a project with yourself now. Educating yourself, listening to what vendors are saying, listening to podcasts, and plug for what you can hear at Moody's. But really educating yourself will set you up for success later on. So a lot of food for thought, but I kind of would say don't go at it alone.
Okay. Arthur, a few words from you here. What would you advise?
I can advise that it is necessary to think and to continuously improve the knowledge, and also Perpetual KYC is something new. It's something that also requests interest from practitioners, and also as traditional KYC is mostly being reactive, Perpetual KYC means being proactive, and also it means continuously monitoring the customers and also to continuously be in line and to focus attention to real alerts based on suspicious, based on unusual behavior of customers.
Okay, that's great. Anton, a few very quick words from you, please.
Sure. So I think, it's very important to approach Perpetual KYC, like cautiously and understanding, that there are many solutions out there, many vendors out there. So understanding kind of really who you're working with, the technology, your data is very important. I would say start with the change in mentality and try to get in, buy-in by the various stakeholders, including SMEs, financial crime compliance, head of businesses and technology teams. Know very well before you embark on this, your current technology, the ecosystem, and the data that are needed, and prepare for the changes. And then whenever possible, I would say use the phased approach, which would allow for a more efficient use of technology and also a more immediate kind of early return on investment, which should minimize some of the human input for low risk customers while focusing resources on higher risk customers.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Anton, and thank you to all our speakers for sharing their expertise and experience. Thank you too to Moody's Analytics for sponsoring today's webinar. Before we close up, just a few items that at 18 Group here that you may be interested in. If you scroll down your screen, you can sign up for our October webinar on how to apply innovative e-com surveillance while ensuring control, compliance, and enhanced productivity, or our webinar on how to harness the power and potential of ownership data. Finally, you can look at A-Team Connect, our professional platform that you can use to deliver highly effective events and webinars. That said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Alex, Anton, and Artur, and thank you to all of you who have taken part in the webinar. Please fill in our feedback form, as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Meanwhile, thanks again and goodbye.